It's difficult to overstate the devastation wreaked by the Second World War. The conflict annihilated homes and cities, it tore families apart, pitted civilization against one another, and led to starvation and disease. Though it varies from source to source, the death toll from the war is estimated at between 70 and 85 million, equating to approximately 3% of the world's population at the time. It's difficult to think of many places and people unaffected by World War II, and there are countless images that have captured the events and emotions as they occurred. Here we look at just 4 haunting photographs taken during this dark period of history. Many landscapes were changed beyond recognition by the aerial assaults undertaken by both the Allied and the Axis powers during the war. Perhaps one of the most continuous of these occurred just months before the end of the conflict, the Allied bombing of Dresden. Prior to World War II, Dresden was renowned as an attractive city of culture, dubbed the Florence of Elba. However, between the 13th and 15th of February 1945, British and American heavy bombers dropped thousands of tons of high explosives and incendiary bombs onto the city, destroying an area some 6.5 square kilometers. This photograph, taken from the top of the city hall, reveals the magnitude of the damage caused. The scene is rendered all the more solemn by the statue poised by the edge of the building, its outstretched hand appearing to invite us to observe the shattered buildings and empty streets below. It is thought that approximately 25,000 people died in the bombing, many of whom were incinerated by the resulting firestorm. But as Dresden had become a sanctuary to refugees fleeing from Eastern Europe, the actual number of fatalities may have been higher, with some guessing the number may be anywhere between 35,000 and 130,000. The necessity of bombing Dresden is still debated today. Intelligence at the time appeared to indicate that the city's industrial output was significant in assisting the German war effort, and it was therefore thought imperative to destroy the reported 127 factories in the city. However, amongst some historians, it has been argued that the city was not responsible for as much industrial support as once suspected. The decision for the aerial bombardment of Dresden, which was controversial at the time, has been described as merely a terror bombing, as military barracks, bridges, and some factories were not targeted. The air raid has been justified and criticised to a varying degree, with criticism ranging from claiming it to be an immoral act, and some proclaiming it as a war crime. What this image shows is the tragedy of war, and it's undoubtedly symbolic of the destruction that affected so many towns and cities at this time, perpetrated by both sides during the war. Now, you may well be familiar with this image, as it's been used frequently in books and documentaries about World War II. The photo is often described as being taken in June 1940, with the man reacting to the Nazis marching into Paris. However, this is not the case. The picture was taken in Marseille in September 1940, just weeks after the fall of France. The country had capitulated to Hitler and had become a puppet government for the dictator under the Vichy regime. On September 15, 1940, the people of Marseille gathered in the streets to watch their forces parade the flags of their now dissolved regiments. After the parade, the flags were loaded into boats destined for Algeria, to be held there for safekeeping. The reaction of the crowd was originally caught by Marcel de Renzis, a photographer working for a newspaper. The weeping man can also be seen in the 3rd chapter of Frank Capra's series of films, Why We Fight, which was produced to explain and justify the United States' role in the war to American servicemen. The removal of the flags and the exile of the French forces was an emotional moment for the population watching that day. as it would have symbolised the loss of hope felt by the French people, as they had to adjust to losing their liberty and living under the shadow of fascism. The weeping man's face perfectly encapsulates a sense of grief and fear, as he openly mourns for his country. The image was later used in Life magazine, and in 1949 the NBC attempted to trace the man in a photo voted one of the best in the world at the time. Eventually, the man was identified as Jerome Brazetti, and the lady stood next to him was his wife, Charlotte. He was approached several times for interviews, but always refused, not desiring any more publicity that he had already attained from the widespread use of his photo. Fortunately, Jerome lived to see the liberation of France before he passed away in 1976 at age 86. After his death, the local newspaper dictated the front page of the news, proclaiming, "The crying Marseillaise is dead." It would seem that Jerome's legacy as the face of sorrow in a time of despair lives on. The USS Enterprise aircraft carrier gained a somewhat legendary status during World War II. The ship and its crew engaged in more wartime activity against Japan than any other ship. She was the first to sink an enemy submarine in the Pacific, and repeatedly sustained damage and casualties throughout the conflict. On 3 separate occasions, the Japanese forces inaccurately reported the carrier to be sunk, leading the Enterprise to be dubbed the Grey Ghost. In late 1943, the ship was headed towards Makin Atoll, where the Japanese forces had taken control of the main island, Butaritari, and established defences there. On November 10th, pilot Ensign Byron Johnson took off from the deck of the vessel in an F6F3 HELLCAT for combat patrol. Soon after takeoff, he reported engine problems and requested an emergency landing. As Johnson attempted to make a controlled landing, his aircraft hit the deck with force. The wing of the plane smacked the carrier's guns, and the belly tank of his plane exploded. The impact of the landing had jammed the canopy of his cockpit shut, leaving Johnson without an escape route. The aircraft was emitting smoke and flames as it listed to one side, and Johnson attempted to get out. This powerful photograph captures the harrowing moment where it looks as though both men could perish, and the incident could injure, if not kill, the startled personnel in the foreground. Mercifully, Tuning successfully opened the canopy and pulled Johnson to safety, but the photograph of this harrowing moment emphasises that for servicemen, peril comes in many forms, not just at the hands of the enemy. Tuning was awarded the Navy and Marine Corps Medal for his selfless actions, and Johnson became a flying ace, winning several medals for his efforts. Though the men never encountered each other again after the war, Johnson came to correspond with Tuning's son, an officer in the Navy. Speaking of his saviour, Johnson commented in a 2002 interview that Tuning was probably the bravest man he ever saw. He was risking his life and didn't give a second thought to getting me out. It was a real act of bravery. In the early stages of the war, many children in the UK living in areas considered to be high risk of attack, such as London, Bristol and Liverpool, were evacuated to more rural areas of the country. Though the government urged parents to let their children remain within the safe domain of their host families until informed otherwise, by January 1940, nearly half of those evacuated had returned home. Other waves of evacuations were prompted by further aerial assaults later in 1940 and again in 1944, as V-1 bombs and V-2 rockets were aimed at the country. This of course resulted in destruction, casualties and death. Perhaps one of the saddest aspects of any war is how it affects the children caught in the midst of its horrors. Between 1939 and 1945, thousands of children from Allied and Axis countries were orphaned as a result of the conflict. In 1945, American photographer Antoinette Frizzle captured this heart-rendering image of a young boy who had returned home after playing, only to discover that his home had been obliterated by a V-2 rocket. His parents and brother, who had been home when the rocket struck, lay buried under the rubble. The young boy clings to a stuffed toy as he looks tearfully out of shot. Frizzle took a selection of photographs of the newly orphaned child, all of which have become internationally renowned. The image has been used in documentaries and exhibitions. It has been reported that the child survived the war and grew up to work as a truck driver. Allegedly, he recognized this photo whilst it was being used by IBM to promote an exhibit in London, and that he contacted Frizzle via the company. It's likely that if he is still alive, this man would now be approximately 80 years old. And though his name and whereabouts seem unknown, we can only hope he went on to find happiness and peace in his life. As for Antoinette, or Tony as she was known, she catalogued life during the war in both the European theatre and for American servicemen and women. After the war, she became a widely celebrated photographer, her work appearing in Life and Vogue magazines. She passed away in 1988, aged 81. So that's 4 haunting photographs from the Second World War. We hope you found these interesting, and as always, we'll see you in the next episode of Wars of the World.